Teton has the same setup as Planescape Torment. You wake up with amnesia and discover you're part of a whole cycle of death and rebirth. You discover that it's very hard to get killed, at least narratively. After all, you survived falling out of the sky. And if you do lose a fight, you wake up where you were killed or close by. You're constantly hunted by shadows. You have a vague connection to everything as your memory returns. You're hunting for a MacGuffin. There's something different or special about you this time round. You have a memory fortress kind of environment. The theme of the story is also not the repeated question of whether one life matters or what can change the nature of a man. And by its own definition, Teton is supposed to be a thematic successor, whatever that means. So if you believed the theme of Planescape Torment was what can change the nature of a man, even though that isn't the theme, but if it was, it's still incorrect. Although Planescape Torment had the question asked about 4 times I can recall, but I have no idea how many times, if at all, it was asked in Teton. Characters are initially inextricably drawn to. So it's almost the same setup as Planescape Torment, but this setup never really works right. The writers never understood why the setup of Planescape Torment worked, and this is all made worse by the setting, but more on that later. If I were to summarize the premise of Teton, it's this. I really, really want to be Planescape Torment, but I don't know how to do that, and I don't have the IP, so I'll borrow another, because people will throw money at a Kickstarter, and I'll be happy making something that sounds similar. Look at that title! Now, I wish I could talk about the premise of the narrative, but that has been stolen by the setting. Again, more on this later. The main character is the last castoff. Now, In Exile couldn't even copy Planescape Torment's premise properly, and you're not the changing god, you're just their latest abandoned body. You're like one of the shadows of the Nameless One, so you're not the Nameless One, and by missing this key factor, Teton falls apart. If you were the changing god, and you were trying to remember the things you've done because of amnesia, that would have been interesting. There would have been mystery as to what and who you were. People would come up to you and recognize you, which does sometimes happen in the story, but ultimately doesn't really amount to anything, as most choices just have you select being not him. So if you were the changing god, you'd realize you'd be your own worst enemy. All the faults of your life would have been yours. The people you've hurt and are still following you around would have their tragic past dragging them down, as well as the NPCs you meet. The player would have a sense of obligation to help these characters, or they could toss them aside again. After all, you've lived for centuries, if not longer. Just like the Nameless One. Instead, we're trying to find out who and where the changing god is, and what the hell is going on with these shadow brain demons trying to kill us. It's completely useless if the recipe for Planescape Torment is present, but when the central component, the protagonist, isn't part of that recipe, then you've screwed up the whole production. It's like ordering a steak and potato dinner at a restaurant. While the potato's fine, the steak is replaced with a steak-shaped tofu. It just doesn't work. It's not the same. If you get the protagonist wrong, everything else is pointless. Now, what I'm not saying is they had to copy Planescape Torment completely, but if they didn't get the most important element, which is the protagonist, then they may as well have copied another game, or another winning formula. Instead, you're a newborn innocent, which takes away all the drama, all the guilt, all the various emotions and importance that made the Nameless One the character he was. You have no sense of redemption. You're essentially an innocent baby. Now, the second problem is you're just the last cast-off. There are other cast-offs, and while the narrative always mentions and reminds us how special you are and how unique your ability is, it decreases your uniqueness in the world. Imagine if instead of the Nameless One casting shadows, those shadows were other Nameless Ones. I don't know, you'd get duplicated in some way or something like that. You'd have a whole bunch of Nameless Ones wandering about, but none of any memory of what the other future one did. Now, that might be an interesting element to pursue when you're looking at your memories, but this amounts to a bunch of people who used to be in your situation, are afraid, and who are ultimately pointless to the narrative. Oh, look, there's another cast-off. Oh, look, there's a group of them. Oh, look, there's a whole community of them. The more of something there is, the less unique and important it is, which kind of makes us look at the question of what does one life matter, and we realize that that's nothing. It doesn't. This is what the story is showing and telling us. There's nothing emotionally or personally valuable about you, the last cast-off. There's no drama, no sense of responsibility. It's just you holding a weapon and people asking you when and how you're going to use it. Aside from your one special quality, the scenarios and situations prove how unimportant you are. So, instead of being defined by the character of the protagonist, they are simply defined by their plot function, which unfortunately is the bare minimum of any protagonist, a walking plot device, which has nothing to do with their secret power or ability. The antagonist is almost never there. That's really nothing special since you're hunting him down, but that doesn't help with giving us a direct example of trying to evaluate or qualify our actions versus an adversary, for example. Antagonists in a story should be showcased rather soon and hopefully frequently. Instead, we get another mysterious force called the Sorrow, who wants to destroy us. We don't exactly know why, though. Why is it called the Sorrow? Why does it want to do all these things? That's pretty much the main mystery of the game and only gets revealed right at the end, making this plot one of fear and escape. This element, I dare call it a character, used to be called the Angel of Entropy, which is by far much more fitting, at least it even makes sense. But this element means you're never acting with a sense of agency. You're always reacting to the sorrow to figure out where to avoid it and how to get rid of it. That's really the whole story of Teton, running away. Oh, and the Changing God, well, we discover he's a computer program that gets destroyed by a logic bomb. Thanks, Colin. Great work. The only one that could be clearly understood was Eratus. He at least made sense, and we understood what his external goal was. Adventure, which unfortunately had nothing to do with the main plot, but at least we got to understand that. We also understood he wasn't in total control of his mind, which is noticeable by the scan thought ability. But still, he's useless to the story, and he's primarily a comic relief Minsk 2.0 guy.
I understand Calesthesias.
The only other companion of any value was Mathkina, because she's just like you, a castoff. And yeah, she's part of a plot point, but ultimately useless. There's no comparison between the two. She doesn't really challenge you or attack your social or psychological weakness, if you had any. It's like all the castoffs, save one or two, are boring and pointless. And yes, that includes the protagonist. For the other companions, I wish I could tell you why they're there or why they matter. Aligern is remorseful, some redemption story about the war or his family. He hates the Changing God. I don't know. He was rather boring for me to care, and I barely bothered with him since the game forces you to take him or Calistege. And Calistege is around because she's curious. She wants power, and traveling you will get her that? This is her motivation to go on a life or death quest, apparently. Is she bored? I can't say. Tibber, no one cares about. Rin exists only to make you feel like crap, because she's a weak, helpless girl. You save her, you try to help her, but she's ultimately useless, and the game is pretty much telling you you need to get rid of her. She's literally excess baggage, even though there was the opportunity for her understanding of the tides to connect with the plot in some way, but that just doesn't happen. There's no reason for this character. Okay, the setting is based on the Numenera world created by RPG guru Monte Cook. It's set in the ninth world, meaning the latest iteration of mankind, apparently a billion years in the future, and all the crazy leftover tech found in many a fantasy sci-fi RPG story is part of the grains of sand of this world. What this means is every setting or environment is sensationally weird and beyond normal. So that pretty much means everything is consistently or constantly weird and alien. It's not horrific, nightmarish, indecipherable weird, but it's pretty high up there. And this is the main problem with the game, or everything in the story. The setting is too big and too openly fantastical for us to wrap our heads around. It's almost like a dream world where the weird is commonplace. It's unnecessarily bizarre. Planescape took the D&D world into the Planescape universe. That worked. It was quirky and just the right amount of attention given to the narrative to make the setting believable and not too mundane. They used that setting to take a look at RPG tropes and reverse them, and to tell a redemption story in the process. Let's take a simple setup for a good story. So a good story starts off with a good, simple premise and hopefully a good complementary theme. You then create the ideal protagonist and antagonist for that story. Then you write the world and setting based on scenarios between these two characters and the conflict that comes about. Then you provide other characters to facilitate the many facets of the protagonist and antagonist. You show off their weaknesses and to compare them to choices throughout their journey. This will illuminate and further challenge those qualities in their personality. That's how generally good stories work. In Teton, the ninth world is set up first. The premise of the story then has to adhere to that. Then the protagonist comes from this, so then does the antagonist, or antagonists. This limits the author to then create scenarios to adhere to all the magical and scientific wonder that is the environment. It's a crutch, meaning it's a bit more difficult to work under this, but it's not totally impossible. And thus the side characters are extensions of the setting. This is how you write a broken story, or a story whose focus is the setting, or where the setting is too big to facilitate these characters and their conflicts, unless they are extremely clear and understood by the audience, since you'll need all kinds of pages describing the wonderment of the setting. This unfortunately doesn't work, though it could have. It would be a rather difficult writing task, though. The one large hub world that was affected was called the Bloom. It's basically a living creature that has magical doorways opened up by strange keys you have to discover. Oh, right, that's called Sigil in Planescape Torment, only it's in the end of this game and not the beginning of it. Instead, the first hub world, or level of the game, is called the Sagas Cliffs, which is essentially a circus, and that the theme of having fantastical showpieces is in every part of the environment is what Teton becomes. A circus. It's all sorts of spectacle for the sake of it, because the setting. This is opposite to what a good story is or should have as a setting. Sensationalism is saved for Michael Bay movies, for the live-action version of Ghost in the Shell, or other such visual extravaganzas. Good writing comes from the substance, drama, and depth of a protagonist's character and the sacrifices they make over the choices they decide upon, not how awesome or weird or strange the setting is that they happen to be in. Since the protagonist is a newborn baby afraid of struggling to survive, this can't really happen unless they take an active role. Since the antagonist is a mysterious AI character, this can almost never happen unless you humanize them somehow. Because your secondary antagonist is a mysterious force of nature who just looks like a giant reaper with a black cloak and tentacles, who teleports into reality at whim and enters your brain, this can almost never happen. Since the tides themselves are a pointless force of nature, it's immaterial to whatever tide you're attuned to. You can replace the tides with any other supernatural technological force, and the plot wouldn't care. Now imagine the ending of Planescape Torment not being about the revelations of discovery of one's past and facing it and fighting the personification of your mistake, and instead it's really about the function and nature of the Fortress of Regrets, and you'd have the ending of Teton. That's what this game is focused on, the setting. Now you could argue the setting is the character, or the sorrow is the setting and main antagonist, which I think could technically work, but in this case, no, it's a broken, convoluted mess. Style is indicative to many things, like structure and storytelling. Unfortunately, this also brings up pacing, which is absolutely horrible. There's just too much content. There's details and adjectives for the sake of them. I'd like to really know who edited this and who okayed it when it was edited. Now, how many people actually wrote certain scenes? Were they falling over each other to fill in words and paragraphs? The narrative feels like there's an unnecessary amount of words or put in for simple descriptions. And yes, it's all about the setting because everything's so weird and alien. You need to explain it to someone so they can wrap their head around it. So there's lots of fluff, and it's to the point of ridicule. The main attention of these kinds of games are the dialogue box, and it makes this annoying sound when you hear it hundreds of times when it pops up. There are items in the game which are totally useless and only exist to further illustrate the setting, in case you didn't know how amazing, fantastical, and odd the setting was. There are other categories of one-use items called ciphers, which are just unnecessary, in case combat was just too difficult or not the focus. Well, this system wasn't even needed for that. The dialogue takes precedence over any other gameplay element, including combat, so much so that it almost is combat, which means combat is broken instead of balanced with dialogue, even to the point where they designed it so you pretty much have to have some kind of dialogue solution instead of a combat solution, or you're not even fighting, or you actually just have to run away. And this is part of storytelling, because they've reinvented combat to be something called a crises. For no reason. They took out the real time with pause, put in their own broken system, and I can't tell you why. And unfortunately, the combat is turn-based and boring. Everyone stands around because it would be too fast-paced if it were otherwise. There's constantly respawning enemies telling you to just run away and try to figure out the problem with dialogue because they couldn't be bothered to make a proper combat system where you might be able to actually win a combat scenario with, I don't know, combat. So the storytelling is exceedingly slow and boring and pointless, and it's part of a crises system, aka broken combat. This is a game in name only to Planescape Torment. Now, if this story was worth it, you'd drudge through this gameplay, but when the majority of the story is dialogue, or that is the gameplay, and the story is about how amazing the setting is, and there's so much text and fluffed up descriptions about the environment and other characters and weird locales, you get really bored. Combine that with the tides popping up now and again that do nothing as far as I can tell, and I'm kind of curious who was actually testing and editing this. And the ending is closer to Mass Effect 3's than I care to draw the connection to it. It's, at least I got to kill the asinine AI separately, with, of course, dialogue, aka the logic bomb. Thanks, Colin. That's something. It really feels like they had a giant checklist and had to check off as many boxes as they could, and this one was the one where the nameless one argues that guy out of existence. And now that I think about it, it's not even a logic bomb. It's something that goes like this. By the way, you're not really the changing god. You should probably go away. Oh, okay. Which is kind of like, by the way, you're not really a spiritual success. I mean, thematic successor to Planescape Torment. I think you should probably go away.